Hi, my name is Travis, and today we will be discussing the Skullduggery lesson plan. And Skullduggery is meant for students to be introduced to a multiple variety of different kinds of animal skulls. We will also be discussing with students the different kind of skull adaptations that animals have. And we will also be relating the functions and structures of the different kinds of teeth on skulls to that of us people. And so for our Skullduggery lesson, we have 6 different learning objectives as up here on the whiteboard. And our first learning objective is to describe the purpose and function of the incisors, canines, and molars. Our second objective is to define the terms herbivore, carnivore, and omnivore, and be able to give it an example, 2 examples of each. We'll also be able to distinguish the differences between herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores based on their skull and tooth adaptations. Number 4 is we'll be able to identify different kind of mammal skulls by using a Dichotomous Key. Objective number 5 will be to formulate and justify their opinion regarding how to classify a person as either a herbivore, carnivore, or omnivore based on both skull and tooth characteristics. And our final learning objective is to relate the different skull adaptations to the life of respective animals that they may find during this lesson and how that relates to the animal adjusting to their environment. So all the materials that you need for the Skullduggery lesson can be found in this big blue bin, either in the basement of Sunset Lodge or in Anderson Lodge. So all the materials that will be inside this big blue bin will be Tootsie Rolls, either in the Tootsie Roll bag or in a bag like this. There will also be a bag of blindfolds that you will need for the lesson. There are also laminated signs for omnivore, carnivore, and herbivore. You'll also have a bunch of rulers for identifying the different skulls. Also have dichotomous keys for all the students to use. We'll also have the Pearson First Guide for Mammals, so that if students are interested in looking up more facts about the different mammal skulls they identify, they can do that. And then we also have 3 bins here of all different kind of mammal skulls, of different mammals we have here in Wisconsin. One way you can introduce Skullduggery is by relating to the students by the favorite kind of food that they like to eat, or any kind of food that they like to eat. And you can relate this to animals also having their favorite kind of food that they like to eat, and that we classify animals based on the differences in the food that they eat. Otherwise, an alternative way to introduce Skullduggery is to introduce it as a mystery that we have here at SWES that needs to be solved. And so for our first activity, we help with training the students to use their senses, especially their sense of touch, to identify different objects to get them in the mindset of being able to identify the different animal skulls. Alright, and so how we train the students to use their senses is to blindfold them. And for the first object you can give the students, you can give them a Tootsie Roll. Now it's important that when you're having students identify any object that you give them to really focus on the size and the shape of the object, also the textures, and especially with the Tootsie Roll as being the first object they identify, you can really have them listen for the sounds that the wrapper makes and also smell the object. And usually students will be able to quickly figure out that what they're holding is a Tootsie Roll, and it's a good way to introduce some of the senses and some of the things we need to keep in mind when we're trying to identify different mammal skulls. So once you have ran through the blindfold activity with the students on the Tootsie Rolls, you would discuss some of the features or things that they used to help identify that it was a Tootsie Roll. And then you would have the students blindfold themselves again, and you would hand out the different mammal skulls that we have for the Skullduggery lesson. And for this specific skull IDing while being blindfolded, make sure that you give the students extra time and to have them really focus on their sense of touch of how the object feels, or in this case, how the skull feels. So really making sure that they memorize this object well. Because after the allotted time that you give them to identify or this object by their sense of touch, you will then collect all the skulls back from the students while they are keeping their blindfolds on, and you will set them into a pile on the table. And it'll be at this time, once you have them all gathered again, that you'll have the students take off their blindfolds, and they will have to identify the skull that they were just holding previously by how the skull feels. And it's really important for this part of the activity that you make sure that each student gets the correct skull back. And then once all the students have gotten the correct skull that they had while they were blindfolded, this is when you can ask them or have a discussion about what were some things that they noticed on their skulls that helped them identify the skull they had compared to all the other skulls that were out in the middle of the table. And this leads really nicely into the next transition of talking about the different skull adaptations. So for the next activity for Skullduggery, what we're going to do is we want to have a discussion with the students about the skull adaptations. So it's good beforehand, before you teach the lesson, that you familiarize yourselves with all the different structures and features of the skull, such as the sagittal crest and the zygomatic arch, or the cheekbone, so that you can be able to explain this to students properly. So a few things you're going to want to point out to students while you're discussing skull adaptations and tooth adaptations is you're going to want to talk about the size and shape of the skull and how this can help us determine how big or small an animal is. You can also talk about the placement of the eyes and how that can help us tell what kind of food that animal eats based if its eyes are facing forward or off to the sides. We're also going to want to talk about the sagittal crest up here too, because that can help us tell how strong of a jaw muscle that animal has, or that mammal has. And finally, we're also going to want to talk about the teeth as well. And so for all the mammal skulls, we're going to want to be talking about 3 different kinds of teeth, which are the front teeth, the incisors, the big sharp teeth, the canines, and then the back teeth are the molars. And the incisors help with the animal cutting into their food. The big canine teeth help with the mammal tearing meat apart, so tearing its food apart. And finally, the back teeth, or the molars, help with grinding food so that the animal can actually swallow it. And while we're reviewing all the skull adaptations, it's also good to discuss with the students the difference between a predator and a prey, and as well as also talk about what are the differences between a herbivore, an omnivore, and a carnivore, and the kinds of teeth that each would have or would use the most if they were either a herbivore, carnivore, or an omnivore. Once you've discussed all the skull adaptations and the tooth adaptations with the students, you would then talk about the tools that the students would use that day to help identify all the different kinds of skulls that we have here at Swice. So the first tool is going to be using one of the rulers. And it's important for the ruler to tell the students that with the rulers, you want to make sure you use the centimeter side, so the side that has more marks on it, so that way they can have the correct measurements. that our second tool, the Dichotomous Key right here, asks for. And so what a dichotomous key is just an identification key, and that each point is going to ask different yes and no questions. For example, if we go to the first question where it says start up here with the big X, it's going to ask, are there canines in the upper jaw, or are there places where there used to be canines? And so if you look at the skull that you're currently holding, and depending on if you can see if there's canines or not, it'll lead to two different possible branches. And so as you keep answering the questions at your dichotomous key, it's going to keep branching until eventually you're going to end up at one of the little X's all across the dichotomous key to your final animal that your skull, that the animal that the skull actually is. And so one important thing to remember with the dichotomous key is to make sure that you review some of the vocabulary words that are on the bottom of the dichotomous key, like basal length, which just means the entire length of the skull, as well as the cranium, which is just the very top of the skull. So it's important to make sure to review that vocabulary. And one helpful thing for students to help them make sure they know how to use the dichotomous key is to actually practice keying out one of the skulls that we have up here. And this has been shown to actually help students greatly understand how to use the dichotomous key. So once we explain our tools, the next thing you can do is you can either have students work by themselves or in groups of 2 to 3 to identify the many variety of skulls that we have up here. And usually students will have more than enough time to identify more than one skull, but there are some things you can do to help fill in this time. You can have students use the Peterson's Guide for Mammals to find out some cool facts about some of the animals that they were able to identify based on their skulls. And another optional activity you could do is you could actually grab some crayons or markers and paper and actually have the students draw out that animal too. And to conclude the identification of the skulls, it's best to actually have students come back together as a group, and they can actually share at least one animal skull that they are able to identify, and share one cool fact or maybe one characteristic that they learned about that animal based on its skull or from what they read in the guide. So when concluding the Skullduggery lesson, one thing we want to do is make sure that we review the learning objectives, so making sure that the students can distinguish the differences between herbivores, omnivores, and carnivores. We also want to review the 3 different kinds of teeth that mammals have, which are incisors, canines, and molars, and also have the students tell us what functions do those teeth play and when the animal actually eats food. And then we also want to review some of the skull adaptations and vocabulary that we learned during the lesson, like sagittal crest and zygomatic arch. And during the conclusion, we also want to relate this back to students. And one way we can do this is by bringing out the human skull and having the students observe the human skull and actually point out some skull adaptations that they notice on our human skulls and compare them to the mammal skulls that they identified earlier in the lesson. And finally, to wrap up the lesson, we can also talk about how these skull adaptations can actually play into an animal and their changing roles in the environment.